Boo-doo-boo-boo. Good, good. All right. How's everybody doing?
Good so far.
Welcome back from spring break. Is this? Yep, that's the one I want. Very good. And we got this. And let's see. Let's look at, nope. Here we go. Let's look at this. Yes. Okay. All righty. Well, admit. What do we got here? We got a dozen folks. Okay. How was your spring break, everybody? Good? You guys have a good time?
Yeah, I had a good time. It was good. I mean, it was COVID spring break, but you know.
Yeah, I hear you. Sorry about that.
No, it is what it is.
It surely is what it is. That's one of my favorite phrases. It is what it is, you know? I mean, well, hopefully things will be getting better here. We're still on course for a face-to-face cinematography 2 in the spring, if that's something that interests anybody.
I tried to sign up, but it was full.
Already?
Yeah.
That'll happen. You know
I had
what?
trouble with that too.
Did you?
Yeah.
You
I
know,
signed up for it early for next spring.
did you?
Hmm.
Well, actually, we don't do it in the spring. It's usually a fall thing.
Really?
I think
might
it
go on.
should be a spring thing, quite frankly. I think you should take cinematography 1 in the fall and then take 2 in the spring, but they got it all messed up somehow.
Weird.
What we got to do though is, I know that the waiting list is this horror show of, stonewalling and and shutting people down. We got to get word to, the administration that they need to have more than one section of cinematography too. I mean, we have 3 sections in every spring semester of cinematography 1.
You could say that for a lot of classes, honestly. A lot of classes only have like one offering. It's kind of annoying.
Yeah. And they say, well, we need more instructors. It's like, well, I'm here, I'm doing 2-3 sections of cinematography 1 and 1 section of cinematography 2, which you would think ought to be a good balance, but there's more folks that want it and not enough seats. So I don't know. There's no specific form or process that you can do other than, just email your guidance counselor and say, hey, what's up? Why is there, there's a waiting list that, is ridiculous. You're never going to get through on it. 25 people is the limit for that class. And it has to do with how many people I can supervise at one time and give you the right face-to-face attention. If I'm showing you a piece of equipment and we're standing there and I'm explaining to you how it works, times how many people can I be effective with in one particular class. And that number, ideally that number would be 15, but it's currently 25, which I try my best to work with. But so then let's have more sections, I mean, they just need a little push, I think, somehow. But that would be what I would suggest is let them know that, there's a bunch of you out there that want another section, because I think at this point, there's certainly enough people on the waiting list. We could have a second section of cinematography 2 very easily, I think. So Okay, having said that, let me get around to sharing my screen. Let's do that. And let's take a look at, so here's my outline. All right, so here's the thing. This is what has sort of happened. So I've got 60 questions on your final, okay? All multiple choice. There's stuff from, it's weighted towards the second half of the semester as a final exam, but there's some stuff that reference back to the beginning out of necessity, and therefore, and I think you'll agree. I mean, with all of the stuff that we've covered, it's nearly impossible for me to be anything but broad strokes in this regard. So I don't want you guys to like get you know really worked up over this final exam. Okay. I'm going to ask you some very basic questions. And really, if you take everything we've looked at over the semester and divide it into 60, it's like 3, 4 questions per section that I could really realistically ask you. And then we're going to hit 60 questions, bang, really fast. So it's going to be the most important points. I'm not interested in trickery. I'm not interested in misleading questions that will suggest to you that you've got to do secondary computations or anything like that in order to arrive at the correct answer. Either this stuff or you don't at this point in time. Okay. And it's general enough to where if your ambition is not to work in the camera department when you get out of college, I'm not going to ask you things that are going to become useless knowledge to you moving forward. Okay. Everything that I'll ask you is going to have something relevant to pretty much any discipline you're going to pursue when you get out of here, whether it's art department or assistant directing or, lighting and grip specifically, even directors, even producers for that matter. It's the basic stuff. It's what everybody should know, I think. And that's really kind of the way cinematography 1 should be. It's a good basic understanding of what this department is, what its objectives are, who's doing it, and a little bit about the particulars, just enough for you to get a good idea. There's nothing worse than, being an assistant director and having no clue what the camera department is doing or what they're up to. How can you be an effective assistant director at that point? And that's going to resonate with your script breakdowns and with your day out of days and with, your actual production schedule and what things you schedule on what kinds of days. If you don't know that a crane is a massive piece of gear that takes a long time to build, you're not going to schedule for it. Or, if a certain kind of shot or a certain scene requires certain kinds of lenses that have to be rented special or whatnot, and how that's going to affect the budget, then you're not really an effective assistant director at that point, right? And you've got things you need to know, things you need to learn. So I think this, becomes a strong course in that regard, and it should help you wherever you end up in terms of your career moving forward. That would be my strongest hope. So I've got a few questions from the beginning of the semester, and then the rest of it is questions, from the latter part of the semester. So let's dive into it. I've just got a little sort of presentation, and that should stimulate, some questions or some things that you may want to ask or address in this session as we sit here and discuss it. If you got a question, just sing out. Don't hold it in. Don't wait till the end, because at the end we're all kind of waiting to just shut this thing down and go do something else. So if you got a question, go ahead and ask it. And what I'll ask you first and foremost, before we get a real head of steam here, is, does anybody have any specific issues, questions, concerns you want to address right off the bat, or make sure that I address at some point in the next, hour and a half? Does anyone have any pressing confusion that needs to be ironed out that we can sort of at least make sure we touch on before we wrap this thing up? No? Okay, here's the other thing. I think next week, your I have your final scheduled for the 28th, I think. And it's going to close on May 2nd. Okay. The semester is over on May 4th. So why am I closing your test on May 2nd? If there's a problem, if somebody oversleeps for 5 days and forgets to take it, something, we got a couple of days to play with. Okay. Before they say no, that's it, because then I got to get grades done like 2 days later, and there's no time. It's over. It's done. Right. So I'm going to open it up on I think it's the 28th. Yeah, April 28th, like right after midnight, it's going to open. That's Wednesday of next week, I think. And it'll be accessible for the rest of that week and over the weekend. And then I think May 2nd is, I think, Sunday night at midnight or Monday night. I don't know, one of those. So you'll have like 5 days to access the test. Okay. So that should not catch anyone by surprise at this point. And it'll be open for 90 minutes. I got 60 questions to do in 90 minutes. Okay. So I've added 50% more time than what I used to. I used to allow a minute per question. Now it's, 90 minutes for 60 questions. A large number of them, I might add, you've seen before. So it's not 60 fresh concepts that you have to identify with. It's maybe 40. Okay. Just saying. So there's that. Okay. Having said that, then let me move forward and dive into this thing. So here we are. So by this time on your bookshelf, I've put 8 manuals on here. You've had reading assignments from 1, 2, 3, really just 3 of these. The others are things that offer the advanced students a little something to chew on before Cinematography 2. This one you should already have from Film 2424. This is a production assistance handbook I thought would be a fun read for you in the event that you're doing things outside of class, outside of school, like over the summer, for instance. You're more than likely get hired as a PA. This is a great little handbook for that. This was written by my friend Mike Uva. This is the grip book. This is something I'm going to dive into in Cinematography 2. And then this is a book on camera motion from Laura Wells. Actually, it's not a book, it's a white paper. And I will definitely be covering that in Cinematography 2. So for those of you who did get enrolled, these 3 documents right here, we will definitely be addressing in the fall. So it gives you a little head start on that. So these are your PDFs that I've made available to you. Actually, I think this one is not a PDF. I think that one you had to buy or rent. But the rest of it, you definitely have access to and you have access to it at any point. I think you guys can still get into this class after it's over, right? I mean, you can go back and look at this class at any of your homework assignments and any of your documents that you submitted, for instance. So you should be able to access these at any point. Okay, so the crux of, or the concern that we addressed here is the idea that by studying cinematography, you acknowledge that there are variables that fall under the realm of creative control, and that you are in the driver's seat of that control as the cinematographer. Okay. And also the notion that cinema, and this is from Tarkovsky directly, this is his quote, right? Cinema is a very difficult and serious art, and it requires sacrifice, right? In other words, investment of your time. You must study, you must learn, you must practice, and then you must, evolve, get better through trial and error, right? And that's a tremendous amount of sacrifice. And that you have to own it. You have to belong to that process. And that ultimately what you do serves the craft. The craft, the craft does pay you back. Okay. So I'm not sure I completely agree with this statement where he says cinema uses you, you don't use cinema. But you could certainly say that's true of Hollywood. Hollywood uses you, you don't use Hollywood, unless, you have a way to cash in on that somehow, which, some people figure that out, but most of us don't. So The idea though is investment, patience, uh, time, subscribe to the processes that are learned and perfected and known, shared and passed on. And then pick mentors, pick role models. Nancy, for instance, was a really good role model. I loved her. I worked three movies with her, and she was terrific. So find somebody that you can learn from, emulate, get advice from, and then take advantage of that. In the first week or so of classes, we talked about the basics of the camera department and who's in it and all of that. I want to skip over all that and jump to what we started with after the midterm. Okay. If you want to see all of that leading up to the midterm, you can go back to week 8 and look at the keynote presentation for week 8, which is everything up to the midterm. Okay. So this presentation is really only the stuff we studied after the midterm exam. Okay. Just to clarify that. Okay. So coming back from the midterm, we jumped into exposure pretty much right away. So does anybody remember what the iconic notion of exposure was, or what was the way we looked at exposure? Do you remember what we called it?
The triangle, the exposure triangle.
The exposure triangle. Do you remember what was at the axes of the exposure triangle? In other words, what was each point representing, or each side? You could look at it that way too. There were 3 variables that affected exposure. Do you remember what they are?
Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO.
Right. And if you can read, you'd realize it's right there on the cell in front of you on your screen. ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop, right? And then we added some stuff. We added a little bit of filtration control. And then we talked a little bit about frames per second as a means of control as well. So yeah, right. So the exposure triangle, and it kind of looked like this in graphic illustration. Okay. We had aperture on one side, shutter speed on one side, and ISO on one side. Okay. And then we talked about specific ways of controlling each one of these variables. And if we looked at each side of the triangle, we could see what the range of effect would be as we manipulate that particular variable. So the first variable we talked about was aperture. And so we realized that apertures come in small sizes and apertures come in large sizes, and that there were things happening with each of those size selections that we could make. And they affected the brightness of our image first and foremost. And they also affected something else. Does anybody remember what that was? Depth of field. Yeah. Uh-oh.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, the aperture is controlling the brightness of our image, brighter as we open wider, darker as we close it down, but it also controls something else. To which I responded, depth of field. Yeah. Right. That's a biggie, folks. That one should like roll right off the lips right away. We talked about the range of aperture values from the realm of the very small to the what we call wide open apertures. Okay, generally starting somewhere around f2, maybe f1.4, as commonly seen, demonstrated in most lenses. Some lenses, I grant you, have a brighter maximum aperture. In other words, they open wider than f2. But for the most part, the average range of stuff you're going to come in contact with is going to start around f1.4, f2, and then proceed 2, 8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, and 16. This is a pretty standard range of f-stop numbers. Okay. We talked about depth of field as a result of squinting your lens. Was the analogy that I used, right? You squint your eyes when you want to read a street sign that's really far away. And basically what you're doing is eliminating diffraction and diffusion that's happening as light hits your eye from stray angles, so that only the rays that come directly into your eye and go straight through your pupil unimpaired create the sharpest image in your mind of what you're looking at. So when you squint, you're eliminating a lot of that extra stuff and only seeing the things that are coming straight through the lens. And if you can imagine light going through a lens and then realize that this small aperture is kind of doing what your eyes do when they squint, and that only the perfect rays are traveling through the very center, that gives you maximum sharpness, right? Which would result in the most depth of field that you could achieve. When you select a subject distance from the camera, it creates a bubble of sharpness around that subject, right? And that bubble of sharpness is kind of offset, 1/3 in front of that subject and 2/3 behind it. And that bubble increases in size as your aperture gets smaller. As you squint harder, more and more things come into focus, right? And we learned about that using the depth of field simulator application that I introduced you folks to. So there was then basically the understanding that depth of field was affected by a set of factors. So the aperture was the primary factor that had, to do with how much depth of field or depth of focus you have in your image, right? There was also a conversation about lens focal length or lens magnification. Lenses with a very wide field of view appeared to have more things in sharp focus than lenses with very narrow fields of view that were more telephoto, right? And the telephoto lenses demonstrated certain kinds of qualities that wide angle lenses didn't. Do you remember visually what the differences between wide angle lenses and telephoto lenses were visually? If I open up the depth of field simulator, would that make it easier to visualize? I got it way down here, but let me just go to, let me just do it like this.
There's more movement with the telephoto lens than a wide angle lens.
Define movement.
Kind of like almost like sway, like when you're holding the camera.
Sweating?
Sway, like side to side, up and down.
Oh, you mean interactive, there's a lot of frame movement, in other words, on a
Yeah,
long lens. Yeah, why do you suppose that is?
because you're like zooming in a lot on, you're like getting into specific detail in the frame versus like with the wide angle, you can get pretty much all of as much of an image as you want.
Imagine the result of light passing through a lens as a projection, right? And that projection is basically a circle. I'm going to draw a circle in the over my icon here. Can you see my finger? Imagine a wide angle lens where the edges of that projected circle from your lens are just outside of each of the four corners of the frame. So there's a circle being drawn that each corner of the image frame is touching the arc on that circle, right? That means the circle is just big enough to contain this frame, right? But that's pretty wide when you consider the distance from your lens to your imager inside your camera. That's a pretty wide projection cone, we call it, where that lens is just barely covering the full frame of your camera, okay, the length by width of your camera's sensor, right? But when you choose a telephoto lens has a very has a really big image circle, and the image circle from your telephoto lens might be well outside of the constraints of the image frame itself, right? And therefore, the effect of what remains in these four corners might represent merely the center of a much larger projected circle, right? And the illusion is magnification, right? Because the only stuff we see is from the very center of that frame, and it is then stretched over the entire image sensor, and the illusion is magnification, okay? So the dynamic frame movement that you're witnessing on a telephoto lens is because you're trying to hold an entire camera steady enough so that only the center of that image circle is being projected onto your sensor. Okay, and that's where that movement is coming from. But if you want to just see what the difference visually is between a telephoto lens and a wide angle lens, this is the best way to do it is go into depth of field simulator, right? So it's dofsimulator.net and just tell it some stuff. So sensor size, what camera you guys like? The Ursa Mini. You guys have several of those at school. So that's a Super 35 image sensor. So let's see, where's Super 35 here? Super 35 is pretty close to APS-C. So I'm going to choose Sigma APS-C. Okay, and then we're going to say 50 millimeters. So we'll go down here to slide this over to say, well, let's say 35 millimeters. All right, I could also type it into this box, 35 millimeter. And then we'll open to an aperture of a 2, just so we get the most effect out of this whole thing. If you look at the subject and you look at the background, you can see that 35 millimeters, we see quite a bit of stuff back there, don't we? We see what is this? It's a building exterior, columns and windows and doors and balconies and steps and all kinds of nonsense. And if we close our aperture down, we see those details getting sharper. So we know that as we close down the f-stop, we see the depth of field increase. We also see how much a 35 millimeter sees with a subject standing full body in the middle like this. So 35 millimeter lens is what we would consider a wide field of view, a wide angle lens, right? But a telephoto lens, something like an 85 millimeter, for instance, like you guys have the Rokinon cinema primes at UCF that you can put on an Ursa Mini. So let's say you pull an 85 millimeter lens out of the box. And so let me change this to 85 millimeter. Uh-oh. Now look at what happened. The field of view is much narrower, isn't it? What happened to all the columns and the windows and the doors? Where did it all go? Well, the field of view is much narrower on the 85 millimeter. The image circle is way bigger than the image sensor. The image sensor is only cherry picking the very best of the image right out of the center and excluding a lot of the details from the edges, right? So you end up with a background that looks like so. And if you close down the aperture on the 85 millimeter, you can see what kind of sharpness can be obtained in the background. You got to go way up here to like a 16 or a 22 to get that image really sharp back there. 32, that's seriously silly small. And 16 is what most lenses have as a smallest possible aperture. So you can improve the sharpness back there. It's still a little soft because in reality, that background is pretty far behind the subject. But with a telephoto lens, it appears to approach the foreground a little bit. That's called depth of compression, lens compression, right? And so we see less of the background and it's really far away. So we can't achieve good sharpness of both the subject and the background because of that distance, but we can improve on it greatly by closing the aperture down. But that's one of the beauties of the telephoto lens. We really don't want the background to be sharp. When the background is sharp, it competes with detail in the foreground, right? So we really don't want that. So we like the idea that the telephoto lens simplifies the background behind our subject and the fact that it's far enough away that we can throw it very quickly out of focus by selecting a very wide open aperture, like a 2.8. 2.8 on an 85 millimeter lens is a fairly standard shot in motion pictures, right? This is what we would call a medium close-up. It's somewhere above the waist, but not, it's not the second button on the shirt. So this is a medium close-up. This is a pretty common frame that you would see in films. All right, and that background is nicely out of focus. It'd be even nicer at a 2, like so. Okay, so the telephoto lens simplify the background. They help us throw the background out of focus a lot quicker than a wide angle lens, and it's less confusing. It looks better on a close-up. If we go to 135 from 85, there's a 135. There's a real close-up, 2-button close'up, right? Here's the top button on my shirt. Here's the second button on my shirt. Look at the way I've got myself framed in my icon right here. And 1, maybe 2 fingers of clearance over my head. That's a standard close-up. Okay. Here's a standard close-up on a 135. Nicely out of focus in the background. Your eye creates a focal point, right, to this subject in the foreground and tells the audience psychologically, don't worry about what's back here. It's out of focus for a reason. It doesn't mean anything. Pay it no mind. This is where you're supposed to be looking, right here into the eyes of this, this beautiful young lady, right? This is what I want you to see. Don't worry about what's going on back there. It doesn't have anything to do with our story. That's the psychological unspoken message you're delivering to your audience, right? So this is a great tool for that. And if you're not playing with it now, you might consider it more in the future. It will help you with a lot of these concepts. Just play with these variables, change them up, see what it looks like. If you want to see how distance affects depth of field, just take your little icon of your talent and move her. You move her 30 feet away, and now look at what the background looks like. It kind of looks like the same kind of background you had on the 35mm lens, not quite as wide, but there's still a lot of area around her. And that is affected by her distance to the camera. And then as she gets closer to the camera, that background gets simpler and simpler and more out of focus. What's her distance here? 10 feet? 8 feet is a pretty sweet spot for a close-up. This is what we call a big close-up in Hollywood terms. A little bit of a haircut, and the crop is happening somewhere around, on the guys, it's the Adam's apple or the necktie knot, but under the chin. So we get a little bit of neck and a little bit of a haircut. This is a big close-up. Okay. Let's go back to my presentation here. Okay, so where was
Good
I?
question.
Yeah.
Will you be posting this PowerPoint into the module later?
You mean like a PDF form of it, or do you want
Yeah.
the video will be up for sure? Yeah. You want the
Yeah,
PDF
like a PDF
also?
as well.
Yeah, I can put the PDF if you want it.
Because I think you did that same thing for the midterm last time as well.
I usually do. Yeah, we can do that.
Awesome.
Okay, so the next variable affecting exposure was the camera's shutter angle or shutter speed, right? So I talked about a film camera. I showed you this interesting GIF, and it kind of illustrates how a film camera works, and the fact that this rotating blade here is adjustable, kind of like a pie, and you can adjust the angle of the piece that's missing to a big piece of missing pie or a narrow piece of missing pie, right? A narrow slice. And the light passes through whatever that opening is that you leave for it to pass through as it spins around and reveals the frame, right, that the film is traveling in front of, called the gate. It opens up and reveals that for a brief moment. The light goes through, it creates the image frame on the film, and then it advances the film to the next frame, and it repeats that 24 times in a second or more, depending on what your frame rate is set to. And this is the mechanical relationship that we that we have sort of reproduced in the digital realm. We no longer have film traveling through the camera, and we no longer have a gate necessarily that's opening and closing, but we still have light passing through a lens, and it's still striking an image collector, what we call the capture device, the sensor. And then the sensor is energizing and powering off, and energizing and powering off, right? And when it energizes, it captures light onto the sensor, creates an image, and then it shuts off. When it shuts off, it signals to the processor to create that image file, sends that to a stack of images that we're going to collect at 24 images per second. And we create this thing digitally, but the principle is still basically the same. Cameras will communicate to us in terms of shutter angle if we want to talk to the camera using that nomenclature, right? So I'm a film brat, right? I cut my eye teeth on Panaflex cameras, and pretty much my whole career that's what we used. We used film cameras. And then only after, when I started my production company, did I switch to digital out of necessity, and as a way to embrace the new technology. So when I use a cinema camera, like for instance, the Ursa Mini, I can have the Ursa Mini and I can talk to it in terms of shutter angle, not shutter speeds. So I will select a standard shutter angle with which I operate the camera at 24 frames per second. Does anybody remember what that shutter angle was? It's happening right here if you can interpret this GIF, this animated image right here. What was the shutter angle, the standard shutter angle for a cinema camera when I record 24 frames per second? Anybody?
Is it just 180?
Just 180? It is 180. Yes, 180 degrees. That's standard shutter angle, right, from the film camera days. But that translates very nicely into the digital realm. If we are shooting 24 frames per second, right, and our image sensor is turning on to let light in and turning off to process, if we turn it on for half of the time to gather light, and then the other half of the time the sensor shuts off and processes that data into an image frame, how fast does that process have to happen? 24 frames per second is the entire image file. 180 degrees is how much pi? All the pi? Half the pi? Quarter of the pi?
Half of it.
It's half the pi, right? Well, 24 frames, what's half of 21 over 24?
Half of 24?
Half of 1 over 24. It's a fraction.
1 over 48.
1 over 48. And guess what that happens to be? That happens to be the resulting shutter speed of your camera at 24 frames. 1/48 of a second. In other words, on and off for 1/48 of a second, and then the rest of the time it processes that image into a data file, right? So in other words, you can say that whatever your frame rate is, 24 frames per second, the common resulting shutter speed at that frames per second is usually double what the FPS is to begin with. So 24 frames per second, double that, that's 48. 1 over 48 is your shutter speed. See how that works? That's an easy, quick cheat. Didn't tell you about that 3 weeks ago. I'm telling you now. 180 degrees equals 1 over 48. That's our benchmark, right? 24 frames per second also happens to be what frame rate? Why do we need 24p specifically?
Because that's the speed that we can read and understand, like people talking on screen without it being out of sync.
Use one word.
Video, film, I don't know.
Audio, sound.
Audio, that's, yes, audio and video are synced up at 24 frames per second.
But that's it. It's like 24p is the frame rate where the lip flap looks like it matches what we hear the words being said, right? So it's for the audio. It's for recording audio. Okay. And I gave you this illustration amongst others. There was a worksheet that also included the cheat sheet for the shutter angle. 180 degrees is the standard. That means half of the duration of 24p, the frame is exposed, the other half of the time the image is processed. You can change the shutter angle and make it smaller or larger. This is 270 degrees. When you open the shutter angle beyond 180, if it's going beyond 180, and if at 180 your shutter speed is 1 over 48, what do you suppose your shutter speed is at beyond 180 degrees? In other words, the light is exposed to the sensor for a longer period of time. That's going to affect things quite a bit. You can look down here if you wanted to and just say 270 degrees equals 1 over 32, professor. And you would be correct. 1 over 32. It's a much slower opening and closing of the shutter because the shutter has more to reveal. And as a result of that, you get kind of those blurry images, right? Like we saw in the Shanghai Express from the Irishman. What's his name? The DP, Christopher. My brain's not working today. I had spring break too, apparently. Anyway, you get a slower shutter speed, much more blurry images. There's lots more motion recorded in the image. And so there's very little fine detail as a result. or you can make a smaller shutter angle, close that shutter down, and reveal less open area at a time per frame. And you can increase the speed with which the shutter opens and closes. 90 degrees is something like a shutter speed of 1/100, let's say, 100th of a second in round numbers, okay? And when you do that, the faster shutter speed allows less time that the light is hitting the sensor. It's an exposure adjustment that needs to be made. But in terms of the motion that you're recording itself, the images appear much sharper because the shutter is open for less time, allowing for less movement to happen while the shutter is open. Therefore, less blur, image blur takes place. So you get what we call the skinny shutter effect, where your images are crisper, almost to the point of being sort of hyper real. And I used the example of, amongst others, the Saving Private Ryan scene, the Omaha Beach scene from Saving Private Ryan, where we illustrated the effects of shutter, both dragging it, making the shutter speed slower, and making the shutter speed faster by using skinny shutter effects. And you can see the difference in the images and how they suggested different states of mind emotionally for the character on camera, Tom Hanks, marching up the beach and trying to get his guys to, to run straight into the machine gun fire. So this is one of the really good examples of manipulating shutter effects and what those results are. Okay, so going back to the exposure triangle, we're talking about shutter speed. We've talked about aperture a little bit. The remaining feature of the exposure triangle set of variables was the ISO, the sensitivity, either the sensitivity of our film stock or the sensitivity rating for our camera sensor, right? In terms of film stock, ISO was directly related to how much silver oxide was stuck onto the emulsion of the film. If you got more silver, you needed more light to transfer all that silver into silver salt, silver nitrate, which was converted in development. If you didn't have a lot of silver, you needed less light to expose by, which would imply a higher ISO, right? But in the process, because there was less actual silver grains on the emulsion, when you developed that emulsion and washed away everything that was not exposed correctly, leaves a lot of gaps between silver grains, which we perceive as graininess in the image, right? Well, the digital cameras kind of work the same way. If there is, the thing is all of the sensors, if it's 1920 by 1080p, whether it's a Canon 24 by 36 millimeter sensor or a Panasonic GH5 19.3 by 17 millimeter sensor, it's still going to have 1080 wide and or 1920 wide by 1080 tall. So the number of image pixel sites isn't going to change, but what will change is whether those sites get activated by light or not. And if they're not activated by light, if there's not enough photons hitting the sensor, then that pixel site just won't give you any data. And when it doesn't give you any data, it can do one of two things: either record it as black or randomly pick some color, red, blue, or green, out of the pixel matrix and substitute that data for what it didn't perceive during exposure. And so that results in either black grainy noise in the image or colored noise in the image. Both of those are undesirable because we don't have enough light for actual exposure to take place. Okay, and that's that's kind of the way the digital cameras work as opposed to the film cameras. So the sensors are going to have a particular sensitivity. So they're manufactured by any number of different sensor manufacturers usually in Asia. Let's say it's a Sony sensor, for instance, and Sony tests this sensor. It's a full HD sensor, 1920 by 1080 pixels. And Sony says this sensor performs best at an ISO of 400. Okay. So that means the manufacturer has assigned a sensitivity rating to that sensor. And it's what we call the native ISO of that sensor, or the base ISO, 400. That's a place for us to start, right? So we'll set the camera in when we consider our exposure triangle, when we're starting to set the camera up, until we really know what we've got in terms of light and everything in the set, we'll set the camera to a few basic settings, and that's where we'll start. Then we'll look at the image and decide if it needs to be brighter or darker, right? So we know that we can set up certain things right away, right? So if we have a native ISO for our camera, according to Sony, of 400, we can set that in the camera as ISO 400. Start there. We're gonna shoot a scene with two people talking at a coffee table. So we're recording dialogue. So we know that our shutter speed or our shutter angle needs to be 180 24p, right? So we lock that value in. We've now locked in two sides of the exposure triangle. The only remaining variable to manipulate is aperture, right? And so we set the camera up. We throw like I always start with a 50. I've even got a 50mm lens on this camera. 50mm lens, open it wide open. And I'll do that so I can light wide open. Look at the set through the lens at its maximum aperture of, on this one, it's a 1.5. All right. And then I'll walk over to the monitor on set and I'll look at the image and I'll go, ooh, that's too bright. Close that down. So I'll holler over to the camera assistant, hey, close that down to a 2.8, let's say. And I'm going to pick that number out of my head because it's usually a 2.8. I don't know what it is. After 30 years of lighting sets, I seem to nail it every time, 2.8 on a 50mm at 24p with my lighting or whatever. I think my brain just already knows what has to be in place for that to happen. Happens automatically. Close it down to a 2.8. Close it down to a 2.8. Looks pretty good on the monitor. Maybe we'll go 2.8.5. Maybe we'll go to a 4. Maybe we'll say, wait a minute, according to depth of field simulator, if I close this lens down to a 4 from a 2.8, I'm going to increase the depth of field. Some stuff in the background is going to sharpen, and I don't want that to happen. So let's stay at a 2.8. In fact, let's do you one better. Let's go to a 2, but now the image is too bright, and I've run out of variables. What do? I got my shutter speed, shutter angle locked in at 24p, 180 degrees. I got my native ISO at 400 right now because the manufacturer said that's where the best image is going to be recorded. And I want an F2. What can I do to make my image just a teensy bit darker?
An ND filter.
I could try an ND filter. Sure, I could do that. I could play with the ISO a little bit. You can go off the native ISO. You don't have to stay on 400. If I go to 800 though, is that going to make my image brighter or darker?
Go to 800 from what?
From 400. We got our camera set at 400 right now.
Brighter.
It's going to make it brighter. Yeah, because we made the chip more sensitive. We told it, you're really 800, and 800 needs less light. So if you give it the same amount of light and change it from 400 to 800, you've made your image brighter. Yes. By how much? A factor of?
Double, 2, factor of 2.
Which equates to, use the words, it is X brighter. Blank, blank brighter.
Are you talking about F, like how many stops it is?
Yeah.
1 stop?
Yes, because it's twice as bright, right? Twice as bright is 1 stop over. Half as bright is 1 stop underexposed, right? A factor of F stops, X F stops, depending on how much brighter or how much darker the image is, right? Twice as bright is 1 F stop overexposed, right? So we don't want to go that way. So we go back to 400 and we want to make it just a little bit darker. So we want to go to a lower ISO number, correct? But if we go to 200, that's 1 full f-stop in the wrong direction. That's too dark, right? We could go in between. There happens to be an ISO selectable on many cameras in between of 320. There's not on the Blackmagic cameras, and I wish there were, because for the first 6 years of digital cameras on the market, 320 was the native ISO of virtually every manufacturer. And that has changed in recent years to 400 or now 800. But gosh, it was nice in the days when we could set the camera to 320, because that was the same ISO as our film stocks, 320 ISO, in many cases. So that relatability, that familiarity is no longer with us in the digital cameras, but 320 ISO was a really good, it was just the right amount of image, not too dark, definitely not too light. And we didn't have to add any neutral density filters, but now we've got ND filters. Okay, so we could add ND filters to our image instead. Unfortunately, they come generally in full stop increments if you go with cut glass, but I showed you guys a really neat item, a cheat, a workaround, and it was an ND, a special kind of ND filter. Does anybody remember what that was?
A variable ND filter.
Yeah. And the variable ND filter increased in density as you turned it in one direction, right? So you could ostensibly stop before you got to a full f-stop of change and darken up your image slightly as a result of the variable ND filter. That's a neat kind of a cheat. Or in this case, what we would have to do is close the lens down just a little bit. And the difference between a 2 and a 2.8, if we would go to a 2.5, that would make the image just a little bit darker. But the difference in depth of field between a 2 and a 2.5 is not that much. It's going to be almost the same looking image. So that's kind of the trade-off right there. It's just a very small amount of added sharpness. But when we're talking about f2 and f2.5, we still have a nicely out of focus background. So this is how you play with all those variables to get it all to work. You know, you could pull out an ND filter, could play with your ISO, could play with your aperture a little bit. The only thing you're not really taking liberties with because of the audio recording is the frame rate, 24p and 180-degree shutter. That's got to stay locked in. But it certainly makes the conundrum of solving your exposure problem pretty easy. The other plan of attack could be you just look at your set monitor and you play with dials on the camera until you see something that you like, but that's pretty random, right? And if you're going to approach problem solving in cinematography in that way, it's really like hunting and pecking around in the dark, you know? So it's not the preferred method of problem solving if you're dealing with a camera and dealing with exposure control, because each of those controls has a specific benefit or a specific sacrifice by manipulating that variable. And so I showed you this alternate exposure triangle, which tells you, you know, the variable that changes with shutter speed is image blur. You get more image blur with slower shutter speeds, less image blur with higher shutter speeds. With aperture, you get more depth of field or less depth of field, depending on which aperture size you pick. And then with ISO, you get more grain or less grain, depending on what sensitivity you choose, right? And I showed you here with ISO, it's a pretty decent rendering to give you a sense of what, you know, what this image would look like at 100 ISO. You can see up here in the sky, you get really the best sense of it. You see almost no black specks in the sky at 100 ISO. At 800, you see teeny tiny specks that, you know, in a motion image, they really don't register as grain. But when you go to ISO 1600, you can see the black specks are starting to get more prominent. And then by the time you get to ISO 3200, you don't need nearly as much light to expose as you did at ISO 100, but look at the sky. It's just loaded with black noise that's going to move around with the moving image and can be distracting in many cases. It can be an interesting effect if that's what you're going for, but for the most part, it can be a very distracting and aesthetically displeasing aspect of your image at a high ISO. Okay. Sometimes you got to go there, right? Let's say you're shooting on a city street in the middle of the night and you got a temporary permit to do so. You don't have enough time to drag out a bunch of lights and you got no power supplies anyway to plug anything in. So you really can't use supplementary lighting at all. You got to go out there, block your scene, get your talent set up and ready to go, choose your angle and your perspective, throw a lens on there that works for your coverage, and shoot whatever light you got. And sometimes if the light is real dim, you know, on a city street at night, then you got to boost that ISO high enough to give you enough sensitivity to create an image. And you're
Is
going to
he
have
frozen
to,
for anyone else?
pardon? Say that again?
He asked if you're frozen for anyone else, but I don't think he is. I mean, you are.
Frozen? No. Oh, you mean like buffering?
Yeah, must just be his Wi-Fi or something.
Yeah, it's probably the Wi-Fi. Anyway, where was I? So sometimes you need to go here, you know, and you need to be able to somehow creatively accept the sacrifice of graininess in your image as a result of having to go to a high ISO, right? Okay, so think about exposure as controlling the image and having an acceptable value of brightness versus darkness, right? I like my images a little bit brighter, or I like my images a little bit darker, which is going to indicate how I might bias my settings accordingly. All right. But basically, it's just a balancing act between too bright and too dark, and just right is in the middle. And then we can play with things like contrast and then color as a secondary concern. But really, it's about image density. It's about contrast here. And you can see how, you know, just right in the middle at 0, and then 1 stop overexposed, 2 stops overexposed, and then the opposite, 1 stop under, 2 stops under. The filtration control that we're talking about, the ND filters, I showed you. This image is sliced into 4 sections. The first section is a typical balanced exposure with no filtration. And then as you put sunglasses, we referred to them, the ND filters, sunglasses for your lens. 1 pair of sunglasses or 1 f-stop reduction is twice the ISO. Okay, or actually it would be half the ISO. 1/4 of the ISO and 1/8 of the ISO. In other words, 1 stop, 2 stops, and 3 stops underexposed. Sometimes at the beach, it's a really bright day, and your base ISO or your native ISO, if it's 800, for instance, the only way to balance your exposure is going to be to go dial way down to your smallest aperture sizes on your lens. And then you get all this crazy depth of field that you probably don't want in your image. So you need to use ND filters, and you might need a heavy ND filtration to compensate for instance, the beach out at Cocoa. You know, if you're going to shoot out there over the weekend, man, it gets really bright between the light bouncing off the sand and the direct sunlight and the sky of the exposure and the light bouncing off the water. You need a lot of heavy filtration, ND filtration, to get your exposures down to the point where the brightness looks good, looks acceptable, right? I showed you the variable ND filter and the fact that it can make the, you know, as you turn it, the image will get progressively darker, which is nice because then you don't have to swap filters in and out. The old style cut glass filters, it's 1 stop density, pull that out. 2 stop density is a different filter. 3 stop density is yet a different filter again. You're constantly pulling filters out and mixing and matching them to get the right sort of light blockage in your image. Or you can just turn these variable filters like you see happening here and close that thing down to almost completely dark. And then you can open it up and brighten that image and then just sort of, you know, feel for it. What do you like? Do you like your highlights a little bit hot, or do you like the highlights with enough detail in there to where you could brighten them in post if you wanted to, but don't shoot them too hot so that you don't destroy the information in those highlights, so that later on you can recall that detail by darkening the image in post. So it's very interesting how you want that image to look ultimately, and then make an aesthetic choice based on what you see through the viewfinder or on your image monitor, whatever, however you're gauging the efficacy of your images. There was another filter that I talked to you guys about. Do you remember? It was kind of like an ND filter. It did reduce the exposure by 2 full f-stops, and it had some other interesting side effects. Do you remember what that filter was?
The polarizing filter?
Yes, the polarizing filter. And the polarizing filter, among other things, it takes all the stray light that's coming into the lens at weird angles and reflecting off and causing what we call diffusion or image fog, and it only lets the best, straightest light rays through the filter, through the lens. The result of that is colors become very saturated because they're the rectified or the perfect light rays are coming through, and they carry the most information in terms of color and color accuracy. So the polarizer saturates our colors. It also reduces the exposure by 2 f-stops. So if the situation's too bright to begin with, you can add the polarizer and knock down the exposure by 2 stops, which might give you the right balance, and then turn that filter so that you can see the light rays being straightened and the colors get really saturated or dense. Right here, you can see it most easily illustrated with sky exposure. This is a polarized sky, and this is an unpolarized sky. You can see that the value or the hue of blue here is really saturated. And over here, it's kind of washed out. So you might like, denser, bluer skies. And if that's the result, definitely use a polarizer. The other filter we talked about was your graduated filter. Clear on the bottom and then some degree of neutral density on the top. And that was basically for cloud or sky exposure control. If you have the correct exposure for your foreground, but your sky looks a little hot or the clouds are a little bit too bright, lacking some critical detail, you could put an ND gradual filter on your camera and just reduce what happens in the top of the frame and leave everything on the bottom of the frame alone. Very nice way to control your exposure without having to control everything from corner to corner, right? Some of the value remains unchanged and it's at the bottom. I suppose you could flip it. You could favor the top of the frame and darken the foreground for some reason, but generally speaking, it's for darkening clouds and sky and leaving the foreground a little bit brighter. Okay, we talked about Ed Muybridge a little bit, talked about frames per second, how it controls exposure. We talked about it in terms of recording audio. In this case, we were talking about it as far as how we record motion in film or video. And we were talking about how many frames grouped together did we need to shoot and then project in order to make normal motion look smooth as opposed to choppy or blurry, right? And so Ed Muybridge did a lot of playing around with frame rates and stuff. He went to the track. I forget where he went, not Churchill Downs, but something like that. He went to a racetrack and shot horses running around in circles at different frame rates and determined at which frame rate the motion looked, pretty good without too much image blur or without a strobe looking effect. And he determined that we need to shoot at least 16 frames per second in order for the motion to look real on the screen when you project it. And of course, the faster the frame rate, the more crisp and fluid the action looks, right? So that's why the old films had a lot of differing frame rates, anything from 16 to 30 or 40 frames per second, because there was no standard yet, because all the films were silent. The minute the audio technology was introduced and married to the visual image, 24p became our standard. Bang. And that was the reason why. We did this nifty worksheet. It was a little bit of a bloodbath in terms of the range of scores. I can tell you though, and it gets better every year. And I'm not sure what that's an indication of, but I can tell you in years past where it was an absolutely desolate situation for anybody who took this worksheet and applied the lesson plan to it. So a lot of you did particularly well, especially on page 1. The biggest reason that folks scored poorly on the worksheet was because they didn't answer any of the questions on page 3. So that aside, most of you did fairly well on substituting the variables out, which I was very happy to see, because once you master this, creative control is utterly yours. And you don't have to worry about being the victim of circumstances, where you've got a light value in the shot that's too bright and you don't have any solution for it. Well, you do in terms of camera control. Okay. Okay. We got into section 2 right around week 10, and we started crafting the image. We went and talked about depth of field more extensively. We touch on it as an aspect of exposure because we kind of have to. When we're talking about apertures, you kind of have to start bringing in depth of field into the conversation early, because your depth of field preferences have a lot to do with your aperture selection with regard to exposure. So it's like you've always got 2 really good reasons for choosing an aperture. It's exposure value or depth of focus value. One of those 2 is going to be your preferred criteria, right? If exposure is secondary to depth of field, you might pick an aperture size that might be a little bit smaller than normal, meaning your images are a little bit darker, but they're a little bit sharper. And sharper sometimes the brain will accept sharper in lieu of brighter in terms of processing an image mentally. But we see really at great length in this lesson plan how you can really start controlling how much of your image is sharp and how much of your image is out of focus. What's more important for your audience to process in this image? The guy shooting pool or the 11 ball? If I see the 11 ball in totally sharp focus and I see the striker softly out of focus, that's telling me that somehow this is more important to the story or what's happening in the story than any information back here. So as a viewer in the audience, I am automatically tuned into what's going on in the foreground, right? And that's just how we guide our audience's eye, right? Do we want them to see in the middle ground, the foreground, or the background? What information is happening that they need to know at that moment in the story or in the revelation of the story? What do we want them to focus on, focus their attention on, right? And then we put the information that we put the performance here. If we want them to, key in on the middle ground, and the important performance will happen here. And you might have secondary action happening in the foreground. Like, maybe you've got, a couple of cowboys playing poker in a bar, right? They're sharp at their table, but guys getting drunk in the foreground, we don't care. Folks standing in the background, belly up to the bar in the background, we don't care either. We want to see the game that's happening here at the table in the middle of the room. So the depth of field won't carry all the way to the bar, and it won't carry into the foreground, so that we don't have competing information for the audience to process and figure out where we're supposed to be looking. We tell them, look here, right here, right? We talk about bokeh or bouquet, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And I don't think either way is necessarily correct. It's generally referred to as bokeh on, any of the videos on YouTube. I always called it bouquet before the age of YouTube. But whatever, as long as you understand that this is an aspect of the aperture that you choose, and the bigger and rounder the circles are, generally those are associated with a lens that's opened up all the way. You see what the aperture looks like when you open it all the way inside your film lens? It's a round circle, right? And the bokeh is reminiscent of that opening that the light is passing through. So a point source deep in the background of an image that has no chance at all of being sharp if you're focused on an object in the foreground, it's going to come out of focus and by degrees and very nice, bloomy, soft out of focus. And a point source will appear round because of the construction of the lens. And you'll notice that as you stop down the lens, you'll see the flat sides of your aperture introduced into the shape of the lens opening. And it's almost like a little stop sign. And so your bokeh at smaller apertures will start also indicating the flat spots of your aperture in the out of focus highlights in the background. Now, in order to see the effect of this most dramatically, you need point sources in the background. So I had an assignment where I asked some of you to demonstrate bokeh specifically as a compositional element within an image. And a lot of you gave me images where the background was out of focus, but there were no point sources back there. So we didn't really get a sense of the bokeh necessarily. If we look at an out of focus sky and an individual sitting on a balcony outside their apartment, that's really not showing me the bokeh of the lens. If you show me a tree in the background and the hot afternoon sun dappling off the leaves, creating little highlights that come nicely out of focus as you choose bigger apertures, right? I can see bokeh then because I can see each little highlight bouncing off a leaf in the tree as a point source essentially. And I can see that point source get stretched out into a big blobby out of focus little donut, which is an indication, or specifically that's the bokeh effect happening. And it can have a very pleasing sort of calming effect. I like it in these holiday pictures because it's the perfect example. Little out of focus Christmas lights in the background and a nice big warm Christmas tulip in the foreground. And you get all this really nice happy little bokeh balls, we call them, dancing around in the background. Works great with city lights in the background. So if you watch movies like, what's that one with Ryan Gosling where they dance around and they sing? Hollywood Story or something like that? And there's a shot where they're dancing up on Griffith Park, right? And the LA's in the background, and it's all these happy little out of focus bokeh balls. And it's very warm and everything because they're in love and it's a very happy scene and they're dancing around. And that adds to it aesthetically. It's very nice to see that sort of shimmery, classic look in the background when we're talking about people thinking or reminiscing warmly and romantically about their time in Los Angeles, right? So it's an interesting way to use this as a compositional tool. Of course, we looked at this already, so I'll skip over that. Section 2.1 was, I think, week 13. No, week 12. We talk about color theory. And we talk about the visible spectrum and everything that we deal with in terms of photography or cinematography is happening in this narrow visible spectrum right here of the total electromagnetic spectrum, which includes X-rays and AM and FM radio, believe it or not. Radio is actually a product of a light wave, not a sound wave. So we have X-rays, ultraviolet rays, infrared, microwaves, FM, AM, all of this. But what we can see happens in this very narrow band right here. And it's reflected by color values at different frequencies. So 400 nanometers is blue and 700 nanometers is red value or red hue. And then in between, we've got all these different values, these different hues. And I pointed out to you that blue screens and green screens happen at very specific frequencies on the visible spectrum. And when we're talking about software that uses chroma key science, where we key out, in other words, a green background so we can replace it with what we call a plate, a background plate, the software will look for a very specific frequency of green and then eliminate that from the image. and it can draw a very clean mask around your subject if it has that specific green or specific blue value to contrast against skin or an outfit or some aspect, a hat, some aspect of costume, right? And we can lift that foreground object right off the green screen and superimpose it on a background plate. And that's basically the chroma key replacement process in a nutshell. And so blue screens happen somewhere around here in the visible spectrum, about 460 nanometers, and your green screens happen at about 550 nanometers. Okay. So that's usually why we're concerned with blue screens being lit properly and without any shadows, so that shadows represent exposure density, which can affect color saturation and in essence, change the appearance of the green hue a little bit to where the software might have trouble lifting a shadow off the green screen and removing it. And so you end up with, what we call ghosting, or shadows in your mask, which can then appear on your background plate. So it's really important for you to try and get your green screens as evenly lit as possible with as few shadows as possible to make it easier for the software to pull your elements. Okay. We also talked about color in terms of a temperature scale, a Kelvin temperature scale. And the basis for the Kelvin temperature scale was a 1 meter steel rod and the physical heating of that steel rod. And we talked about how if I take that steel rod and I heat it to 3,000 degrees, right? That steel rod is going to glow, and the color of that steel rod as a result of being superheated like that is going to be a really bright orange. So you've seen pictures of foundries and stuff, right? National Geographic or in US News and World Report, you might see a shot of guys working in a foundry, and they're shoveling coal and coke into a furnace, and they're heating the metal to liquid steel and pouring it in molds and making metal things, right? And the steel pours out of the pestle or the out of the reservoir, and it flows out bright orange, right? It's glowing red hot. 3,000 degrees Kelvin is an orangish or reddish color quality to our lighting. Conversely, if it's daylight, it's bluer in color, and it's at a much higher Kelvin value, somewhere around 5,600 degrees Kelvin. And that's when light appears whiter or bluer in contrast to 3,200 degrees Kelvin down here, okay? And it has to do with objects being superheated and how much light they give off as a result of temperature, okay? We have lighting that simulates the bluer outdoor quality, and we call those daylight fixtures. And we have lighting that has a warmer, in contrast, it's cooler than daylight, but we call it a warmer quality because it's an orangish kind of output from these fixtures. We call that tungsten balanced lighting, right? So interior lighting, like the lamp in your living room next to your sofa, or the desk lamp in your bedroom that you study by, or the lights in the library, or candles. They all have a warmer, oranger quality to them. And we know this because the human eye can discern the differences between hues of color, especially if both of those colors are in the frame at the same time, right? And I illustrated this by describing to you, let's say you take a walk in your neighborhood at night, right? And you're walking down the street, and the street lamps are all kind of whitish, greenish in color because they're using mercury vapor bulbs. But every house that you pass by that has a light on, the light inside the house, if you look through the window, it looks kind of orangish to your eye, because you're standing in an environment that's lit by a different kind of light source that's bluer and greener in color than the light inside the house, which is redder in color because it's a a light bulb with a filament in it that's radiating at a different color temperature, 3000 degrees Kelvin or less. But the minute you walk inside that house and stand in the living room, your eyes adjust and everything looks kind of whitish again. But if you look out the window to the street light outside, you'll see that that street light has an odd greenish bluish quality to it, right? Because the mercury vapor street light is burning at a different color temperature than the lamp in the living room. And your eyes can register that difference if they see both sources in the frame at the same time. Okay. That's how we know they're different. Otherwise, our human eye has a miraculous ability to adjust and correct for whatever light sources we're using. Just as a sidebar, I told you that candles burn at a very low Kelvin temperature of upwards of 1900 degrees Kelvin. The sunlight we associate with 5600 degrees Kelvin. Artificial theatrical lights we associate with 3200 degrees Kelvin. And then candles are way down here at anywhere from 12 to 1900 degrees Kelvin. And there was a very specific reason why we're dealing with these colors. And it was because of the principle of creating images, three-dimensional looking images in a two-dimensional medium. And psychologically, we talked about within a visual frame, orange hues and blue hues appear in different points in space within that frame, from the foreground, middle ground, and background. And the idea was psychologically, the human eye tells us bluer objects or bluer light sources are happening in the background, and warmer light sources are happening in the foreground. And by using bluer light sources in the background and warmer light sources in the foreground, especially for night images, interior or exterior, we can give our frames a sense of depth beyond depth of field to help this audience discern what's happening in the foreground versus what's happening in the background. It's a very interesting way of carving up visually the image into deep background and close foreground. Cool colors are said to recede to the background. Warm colors are said to advance to the foreground. Okay, and then you get this interesting contrast here as well. Blue and orange happen to be opposite one another on the thing we talked about called the color wheel. If you look over here, here's blue and here's orange over here. They're directly opposite one another on the color wheel. And no matter how many hues you add to this color wheel, no matter how finely you dissect each of these color swatches into more shades of orange, more shades of green, more shades of blue, pure blue and pure orange always end up directly opposite one another. Okay. So they're what we call chromatic opposites. And then, so we have primaries, additive primaries, we have subtractive secondaries, we have the color wheel itself, and then primaries end up having two different identities, right? We have RGB, red, blue, and green. We associate those three colors with the primary light blending process that we use in photography. We are using lights to light up our shots, right? And so when we turn on the right combinations of lighting, let me see if I can illustrate this properly to you. If we have a blue light, a green light, and a red light, and we shine them all at the same point on a white wall, we will get the effect of, if we could line them up perfectly, we would get the effect of a white light on the wall, okay? Because they add together in a primary way, because they're light sources, that the more light you add, the whiter the color value becomes until it becomes pure white. Okay, that's why overexposed images appear white in color, not black in color. Underexposed images, on the other hand, represent the absence of light or not enough light, and as a result, underexposed images retreat to darkness, whereas overexposed images emerge into white overexposure. Okay, adding light equals white. Okay, but then why do we have red, blue, and yellow over here, also called primary colors? Because if you're mixing solids like paint and if you're mixing pigment values. You can make green by mixing blue and yellow together. But if you mix blue and yellow over here with light sources, all you get is a brighter aquamarine color that's whiter than what you started with. But pigments react a little bit differently. Blue and yellow makes green when you're mixing paint. Blue and yellow makes white if you put too much of it together with lights on a film set. So the primaries are different depending on which department you're working in. So you might ask an art department coordinator, what are the primary colors? And he'll tell you red, blue, and yellow, because they deal with paint and textiles and they deal with reflective values. And then you might ask the gaffer, what are the primary colors? And they'll tell you red, blue, and green, or the cinematographer tell you red, blue, and green, because they're dealing with lighting and the addition of lighting towards an overexposure value, which is white. Okay. So understand that primary colors are slightly different depending on who you ask. But for video purposes, it's red, blue, green. Okay. We talked about the psychological effects of color on the audience, and we talked about what some of those colors represent emotionally. We gave them a label, right? So everybody kind of understands that red represents passion, love, intensity, could also mean anger. We talk about orange emotionally eliciting feelings of friendship psychologically, yellow happiness. If everything is kind of lit with a golden edge to it on a film set, we associate that with a lighter feel, a happy feeling, right? Think of movies that have golden edge lights, and it's probably a romanticized image that you're looking at, right? If it was a scary image, you certainly wouldn't have golden edge lights on your characters. You might have some other color, to signify the emotions that you're trying to elicit in a horror film, right? Whatever those might be. Red, the color of blood. Oh, God. Purple, royalty. It can also be honesty or success. Blue is trust, generally speaking. Green is wealth. Green could also be envy or sickness, right? Brown, comfort. I don't know. That's kind of a vague one if you ask me. Black is really a shade. It's not a color, but black, if you talk about it in terms of its color quality, could indicate power, could indicate sickness, death, right? The unknown, fear, anxiety. So shadows in your images can generate the same kinds of feelings in your audience, right? If your shadows are deep and dark and blocky, we call it, which means they're real black with not a lot of detail, that can induce feelings of anxiety in your audience, just that in that respect. That's why horror movies tend to be backlit mostly, very little front light, very little fill light, with deep dark shadows on people's faces, because it's scary, it's unnatural, and the absence of detail, the absence of light, is the essence of fear, the essence of being cut off from God, cut off from knowledge, in the dark, right? All of these psychological connotations. So this is where the notion of lighting and specifically things like chiaroscuro, which I'm going to talk to you about here in a couple of frames, come into play, right? So when we talk about lighting, we're talking about creating three-dimensional images in a two-dimensional medium. So we're trying to represent volume and texture and space on a flat surface, a screen, whether it's a projection screen or a TV screen. That's a flat surface. And, if you look at it, it doesn't have depth. It has one layer, and that's it. And then we imply volume by the way we shade things with light. How do we introduce shadows and textures onto our subjects? And then what color is the light? Is it in the foreground? Is it in the background? Okay. All of these powers that we can exert over our images using lighting as our tool. We can also inject meaning into the image based on what angles the light comes from and hits our talent, right? We talked about a subject that's half lit, and there was a psychological connotation with a subject that's half lit. Does anybody remember what that is? If you see a subject that's half lit, what were we associating that subject with? What ideas?
They're conflicted with something or trying to make a decision.
It could be conflicted. I got to choose. I say again.
Duality.
A duality of something, right? Do I do it? Do I not do it? Do I pick one or the other? Is it good or is it bad? Is it hot or is it
conflict?
Yeah, exactly. So it's somebody who's conflicted, maybe. A half-lit person might also be somebody we might say who's got a decision to make or who's hiding something. If half of their face is in shadow, they're only telling half truths, right? Light is associated with truth. Shadows are associated with deception. So somebody who's half lit might be lying to you, or they might not know the truth themselves. Okay. So there's lots of metaphor in our lighting if we think about it, and we're creating dimension and emotion with our lighting. This is something that I love to go over in cinematography too. I talk about the emotional effects of lighting, and then we practice different lighting schemes that go beyond simple 3-point lighting that elicit specific responses from the audience: fear, love, whatever, by specifically by lighting and the angles of lighting. But we stick with, in this class in Cinematography 1, we stick with the basics, which is 3-point lighting, creating shape, form, and texture. And I showed you guys this video from Sparkles and Wine. It was called, what is it called? It's called, what is this thing called? I forget. Sparkles and Wine. Oh, here we go. Let me go full frame. Remember, it's showing you the key light, and it's showing you, as you change the position, how it kind of makes the subject look somewhat different in their tone. So you get front light and back light and side light. And if you analyze all the different ways that you can interpret how that subject might be feeling or about to act, depending on where the key light is coming from, that's the essence of nonverbal communication used in lighting. So that's a fun video to look at. It was only like 3 minutes, but it's an interesting way to think about your light, because if your light comes from the front, from the direction of the camera, what is that response from the audience you can generally expect? If the lighting is kind of flat and frontal, what kind of mood is usually derived from that kind of lighting scheme?
Didn't you say that was like beauty lighting if it was just full flat face?
Maybe. Like for instance, a Clairol or a Maybelline commercial. The whole idea is, what's that? Say that again.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, isn't it supposed to symbolize like comedy? Like, isn't comedy lighting usually way more flat?
Comedy is usually really bright and flat, and that's for the value of performance. Okay, so let's take both of these scenarios. Beauty. Okay, if you're doing a Revlon commercial, what have you got? Okay. Obviously there's bias here, but if you're doing a Revlon commercial, you've got a beautiful woman on camera, right? Whoever it happens to be. I think the most recent version was using Charlize Theron, right? Pretty girl. Okay. She's sitting down looking at the camera. The light is very flat because the whole idea is, if we introduce any shadows, we might misinterpret the shape and texture of the face, the quality of the skin. We might somehow inject meaning or emotion into that lighting that is not the point. The point is we're looking right at her, and her own beauty and the makeup applied to her to bring out that beauty, right? So we don't want any texture or bias in the lighting. So we do what we call pancaking her. It's flat, okay? So that if the bridge of the nose is what we associate with the perfect aesthetic, or the shape of the jaw, or the squareness or roundness of the face, whatever those preferences are, we're associating with true beauty, okay, then we want to see those unaffected details in the image. We don't want the lighting to bias that in any way. So we pancake them, right? Or we put the light slightly above the lens so that we get just a little shape under the cheekbones, a little bit of a shadow under the chin, a little bit of a shadow under the nose, but nothing that alters the appearance or the shape of that nose, right? So the beauty lighting tends to be very frontal. Comedy works the same way because it's very broad and very flat to the front, because shadows introduce what? Anxiety, right? If somebody's being funny, the last thing you want is to depress your audience, right? So shadows can have a negative effect. So in comedy, we avoid them by only using them when necessary to truly define specific shape, but not to inject any emotional shape into the actor's face or the background or whatever. And then we light a lot from behind the subject to create separation from the background, so that when you get somebody crazy like Robin Williams, who's bouncing around and moving all around the set and being very spontaneous, if you gave that person a very specific lighting scheme that they had to stay within in order to have the right molded or sculpted shape and just the right amount of edge light and just the right amount of fill light, there would be no spontaneity in the performance. There'd be no energy in the performance. You got to give that person room to roam around the frame and run around the set if necessary. And the only way to do that is to give it the broadest possible lighting scheme that gives you good exposure no matter where that person decides to stop and elicit performance for you, right? So you don't want it to be too dark in the background. If he decides to run in the background and do something crazy and zany, you might not be able to pick up on that as well because it's dark in the deep background. So we got to have a lot of light all over the set for a comedy, which is why it ends up tending to look very bright and very flat. So those are two good justifications for flat front lighting. But beyond that, if we want drama, if we want conflict, the conflict resides in opposites, bright versus dark, right? Light of knowledge, the dark of questions, the dark of death or unsureness. And those things are constantly in conflict, which supports tones in a dramatic script of good versus evil, conflict of a hero versus a protagonist. And so we want shadow and we want sculpting. We want what we call modeling, shaping of that subject with selective dark areas and selective bright areas. And sort of the guy who kind of kicked it all off for us was this dude right here. And does anybody remember his name off the top of your head?
Rembrandt, that's also on the picture. So
No, it is, but it's very small. So I figure maybe some people can't read it. Yeah, Rembrandt van Rijn was his full name, but we all call him Rembrandt because he was oddly the only Rembrandt in art history, which is very strange. So here he is. This is the dude, right? And this is a self-portrait. He painted this of himself when he was around 30, somewhere between 29 and 32, I guess. And you can see it's kind of moody, isn't it? It's got a very interesting sort of highlight here, and you can tell by where the highlight happens on his face that this light is somewhere above eye level, because it's darker down by his chin, isn't it? So the light can't be at eye level because then his chin would be much brighter than it is. It's not. It's kind of dark. It's radiating into shadow, and the highlight is in his forehead. So this light is above his head. It's over here somewhere because this whole left side of his face is rapidly transitioning into a shadow, a very deep shadow with very little detail in it. So there's almost no reflection happening over here to fill this in or lower the contrast. So we're getting a very sort of high contrast image with a highlight here that radiates towards shadow over here. And then we get this interesting little golden triangle right here, which is a dead giveaway of the position of the key light, because it's really a nose shadow that's creating this if you look real closely. So where is the light? Is it slightly behind? Is it parallel with the subject or slightly in front of the subject? Well, if it was slightly in front of Rembrandt, then it would be reaching further over onto the dark side of his face, and we wouldn't really see this triangle emerging here. This would be much brighter. So the light is probably happening, you know, parallel to his shoulder blade here, and the nose is striking this shadow here, creating this golden triangle. This is his key light, or his main light, which is providing this highlight here, represented over here on his low side or his shadow side, right? And we get both eyes with a highlight, because if the light is just in the right spot, it'll actually reflect in the low side eye without creating any additional brightness here. But if it's too far around, you'll get a highlight only in one eye, and that's not always preferred if you're going to shoot this guy in close up. Now, if you're shooting him from far away, you might not detect those little twinkles to begin with, so you don't worry so much about it. Okay. But this whole structure and this whole notion of which angle is the right perfect angle for the face, this is all in Rembrandt's philosophy of lighting his subjects. And because of that, and because it's so sort of analytical and specific, it kind of became the basis for all of our lighting. And we associate a well-crafted key light and a well-lit subject as having Rembrandt lighting, right? So we call him like the father of motion picture lighting and stuff like that, all these sort of reverent phrases to describe Rembrandt and his technique. And actually, in reality, his technique sometimes was actually well-crafted side light. And there is no sort of golden triangle over here. This is classic Rembrandt lighting. And then this is sort of secondary Rembrandt lighting, the half-light look, but where the main source of illumination is also slightly illuminating the background, and it radiates from a central highlight off into shadow, just as the highlight on the face radiates into shadow, transitions into shadow, right? This whole notion of highlight and contrast with shadow and the way it sort of transitions from highlight to shadow is all part of the Rembrandt philosophy. And it's something that becomes the basis for our own cinematic lighting aesthetics, right? Chiaroscuro is an Italian word that basically means the interplay of light and shadow. Okay, so chiaroscuro describes this situation pretty well. The way the highlight and the shadow come together in a facial composition that gives us mood and tone simply by its placement and the opposite reaction, the shadow reacting to the highlight. And lots of artists over time have taken advantage of the highlight shadow relationship. This is a sketch from Leonardo da Vinci from 1467, charcoal on parchment. Even with just charcoal and nothing else on paper, look at how well he suggests a highlight in the forehead of this young woman, and how delicately he introduces contrast and shape to the cheekbone, and how dark you can get the shadows and transition lines that create shape and texture on the face, right? This is all, you know, the same kind of thing we're thinking about when we use a light on the face of an actor on a set. This is Caravaggio, a classic character from the history of the art world. He did a lot of moody paintings like this. This is Doubting Thomas, circa 1600. And you have the Jesus character and the apostles, Thomas being the one examining the wounds of Christ after the crucifixion. So it's a, you know, it's a dramatic play that was popular at the time, depicting a common theme that was, you know, on everybody's mind. But look how moody the lighting is here. It's very suggestive and very very indicative of a thoughtful, deliberate process. Christ is supposedly risen from the dead, and so he's not very well illuminated here. In fact, he's turned away from the light and he's mostly in shadow. The light, so you could derive a lot of meaning from this kind of light, right? If Christ, according to the legends, is the Son of God and God resides in heaven, and heaven is the epitome of what we all ascend to when we die, the purification of the soul and the entrance into eternal bliss, right? That would be represented by a lot of light and a lot of very golden light, suggesting happiness and peace and knowledge. And if somebody is turned away from that light, the psychological connotation is that they have lost faith, or they have lost grace, or he's back in the real world. In other words, man, I was almost there. They crucified me and they killed me, and I was on my way to heaven, and I got pulled right back in, like Michael Corleone says, just when you think you got away, they pull you back in, right? He's back, and he's sad as a result of that. I'm not returning to heaven to take my seat by the Father, the Holy Father. I'm back here with you, sods. What's going on, right? And he's going, I don't even believe you're really here. And he's poking his wound, right? And he's lit in a way that, he's not necessarily very aesthetically pleasing either. He's got deep shadows, which indicate his confliction, the fact that he doesn't believe. And these guys are kind of in the same boat. They're not fully brightly lit. They don't really believe what they see either. So Caravaggio is suggesting that Thomas wasn't the only one who said, I call bullshit, right? That they all were kind of conflicted about how they felt about it. And, the whole lighting scheme is speaking to us in subtext, right? By the lighting choices. So what I'm asking you to do is to learn how to see the light, right? How to, don't just take it at face value. Just because you walk into a room and the light's coming from that direction over there, and the windows here, and it's bright daylight sun outside, that doesn't mean anything. You have the power to change all of that, and look at the scene, look at what you have to work with, and make some choices about what has to change, and then make those changes based on your training. If you need the light brighter, manipulate exposure or add supplementary light. Do you want the light to have a certain quality? Maybe add some gel to it to introduce some color. There's all kinds of controls now. And so the way you look at light and how you approach lighting a set is very important. If you start working professionally and you start working in a place like Hollywood, right? Production's going to rent a soundstage for you to build sets in and shoot movies in, right? And when you go into the soundstage and you close all the doors and you turn the lights out, it's pitch black in there. And you don't want to shoot with the work lights on because they're absolutely ugly and they're the wrong color anyway. So you have to add light. Well, where are you going to add it? How are you going to put it in there? The position of that lighting is very important. It elicits emotion. It gives information. It reveals shape, color, character, right? And if you're starting from a black box, you got to know what light looks like and how it applies itself in the real world. So be attentive when you go out to a restaurant, let's say, or when you go to a coffee shop, when you're sitting on a park bench in the late afternoon. What does the light look like? How is it happening in nature? And how might you reproduce that if you had to in a deep, dark place like a soundstage with all the lights off? And what kind of instruments would you use? That's the whole craft of lighting in a nutshell. Can you reproduce reality with artificial instruments and get it to look as realistic as possible? Kind of the way these guys mixed pigments into colorful paints and applied them to canvas and gave us visions like Supper at Emma's by Caravaggio, or The Maid with Milk by Jan Vermeer, right? And he's using the quality of light that came through a window in his studio and what that quality of light looked like when it was applied to his subject wearing the standard outfit of, a farmer's wife, maybe, who just got done milking the cow, and she's brought the cream inside for breakfast. And this is what she looks like standing at the table lit by the window light. How does it look? And then how would you do that on stage? If the art department built you a kitchen that was very convincing looking and gave you a window, how would you apply the light to this person with the stage lights off and make it look like this, daylight coming through? You have to have a plan in place, right? We talked about the quality of light and point sources, and a candle represents a point source of light. A very small radiant source is a point source, right? A big giant light, especially like a balloon light, maybe, let's say, that's a very big, soft light that's introduced into a situation, and it's going to have a kind of certain contrast about it and a certain, so hardness or softness. Are the shadows deep and dark from it, or are the shadows kind of open and full of detail, right? Low contrast lighting. A candle's a very contrasty point source of light, and it gives us very distinct quality of shadow depending on the angle that it strikes the subject, right? So this guy's fairly open to the candle because he's slightly behind it and more front lit than this guy who is more side lit to the candle. And he's turned away from the camera lens, so he's lit on the eyes and the nose, and he's got this really great transition shadow that defines his eye socket and jaw and chin, and then radiates to dark shadow behind. And we talked about that being the basis for the light meter science that we use to calculate exposure on set. And we called the notion of how bright a 1 foot by 1 foot piece of white card would be if it was illuminated by a 12-inch candle with a 1-inch flame from 1 foot away. That relationship is what we call a foot candle, and that is the basis for the calculations made by a light meter when we're trying to figure out how to set our film cameras, right? And I showed you my light meter and how it works. You put in your frames per second and you tell it your base ISO. You plug it in by using these numbers and this activation button here. You stick this little white lumisphere into your light source, push the activation button, and it will tell you an equivalent f-stop to set your lens, right? And so you want to place this lumisphere, for instance, if this was the light source and this was the subject I was photographing, I'd take that light meter and I'd probably rest it right next to the person's temple right here. And I would take my meter reading as a result of that. So like if I've got my Sekonic here, if I was, well, all right, I've got a light over my head, right? And it's lighting me kind of top to bottom, the way the candle's lighting this guy side to side, but it's the same thing. I'm going to extend out my lumisphere. So it's kind of poking out. I'm going to turn it on because that helps. And then I'm going to sort of point that lumisphere at my light source. And then I'm going to hit the little actuator button here. And if I point the lumisphere at my light source and I'm looking at the camera, which is here, I'm going to get a reading. And this is telling me 5.6, just like the slide, except I'm at 24 frames per second. You see that? So that tells me where to start looking at the image at a 5.6 at 24 frames at, what did I dial in here? 800 ISO. That's the base ISO of my Ursa Mini, okay? So that's where I start. And then I go to the monitor and I look at that. If I don't like it, what's wrong with it? It's a little too bright. Well, close the lens down just a touch, or dial in a little ND, or drop a filter in front of the lens and see what that looks like. The rest of it is kind of salt to taste, I say, right? You can start with what the light meter tells you, and you can treat that as your final solution and just shoot it like that. Or you can say, all right, the light meter feels this is what's right, and my eye suggests that a minor tweak will improve what I see and be more favorable based on my taste, and so I might do that, right? The approach is your choice, right? The more involved you become in this as a career and the longer you do it, the more your preferences are what you rely on, and then you only use the meter to confirm your preferences, not to inform your decision, because you already kind of know what's needed, and then you just stick the meter in there to say, yeah, I knew that, I was right, that's right, that's what I wanted, that's right, oops, something's wrong here, I dropped the ball over here. What's wrong with that? Oh, that light's not bright enough. Bring me in, you know, a bigger light unit, or take some of the diffusion off of it, or take some of the reduction scrims out of the light so it becomes brighter. Focus it in on me, maybe. Okay. The meter becomes confirmation, not instruction. But in the beginning, you need to rely on a tool like this so that you have enough image in your image file to create a good looking final film when you project it, for instance. Lots of stuff looks nice on the little tiny viewfinder on the back of your camera, especially the little Panasonic. I don't know what I did with mine. It's around here somewhere. Well, here's your GH whatever, right? That's a pretty small little screen. If I flip it out, you can get a really good sense of how big this actually is, right? That's not very big, that screen right there. Okay. And so it's really hard for you to get a good sense of the quality of your image if you rely on something that small to confirm whether it's too bright or too dark, or whether it's in focus or out of focus, right? So I always use a set monitor that's at least 19 inches in diameter, in diagonal, right? Or bigger, 24, 27 inch, right? I get a nice big image to look at. Then I can really evaluate focus and quality of color. I can see if my highlights are burning up and losing detail, or whether they're just right. And then I can make my sort of final lighting decisions based on that. We call it an inspection monitor, on that inspection monitor. And that's how I refine my lighting now in the world of digital. But once upon a time, it was all about making sure that all the values fall within certain tolerances, mathematically speaking, and you had to use a light meter definitely in order to know where you were at, okay? So the digital world now is the perfect blend of old school and new school, you know, just using the monitor. A lot of pros will use both. You know, it's a good, like I said, it's good confirmation. It also keeps us sharp. You know, if I know now, we call it falling out of the truck. If I know how to light a set falling out of the truck, in other words, I think it needs to be that light over there in that spot, put that light over there as a backlight, bounce this light over here off of something white and reflective over here for just a little bit of fill. And I walk over to the monitor and I look at it and I go, yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted. And we shoot it. That's because you've done it so much that you kind of already know what needs to happen, how big it needs to be, and exactly what point in space it needs to be set at to hit your subject. All of that is trial and error. The more you do it, the better at it you get, to the point where you can work very quickly as a result of having a lot of experience, right? So we looked at some examples of classic art and how it affects modern cinematography. And the idea that, you know, here's a European DP. This is Pete Shishitsky. He's English, right? You know, he's been to the National Gallery a number of times. Wonderful place. And he's seen the, you know, the Man in Armor a number of times. And, you know, he's lighting Star Wars. Here's, you know, Barbieri, and he's doing the, you know, the Death of Cleopatra. Here's Gordon Willis shooting. He's an American, but he's from New York, so he's cultured, and he's, I'm sure, been to the Met in New York City enough times to see things like this, and knows how to apply this emotion and energy to a feature film, right? Here's Ed Hopper, right? Postmodern American naturalist, right? Here is, who's this? This is Rob Hardy, another Englishman, right? Doing Alex Garland's Ex Machina, right? And he's taking the same principles of sort of volume light and soft, low contrast, deep background shadows and environmental quality, and putting that in a movie with a lot of glass and a lot of architectural lighting, right? And so we're saying, well, where do you put the light? Well, where do you start? Well, the scheme that I introduced to you folks is the 3-point lighting scheme. And all that is a place for you to begin your lighting exploration of that shot, of that scene, whatever it is. We prescribe 3 lights to use, and each light has a specific job. We have a key light, a fill light, and a backlight, or an edge light, we call it. The key light, as the name might suggest, means it's the main light. It's the one we put there first, and it creates the shape. It generates the texture or reveals the texture. It suggests the color of your subject, as well as providing enough illumination for exposure. Okay, so exposure, shape, texture, color, right? That's a key light. And so the key light works most of the time on, the camera side of the world, shining towards the subject, slightly off axis from the lens, anywhere from 45 degrees to as many as 90 degrees, coming all the way around to the side of the subject, right? Or sometimes even from the back of the subject. And that will reveal the shape of the face, the shape of the head, the shape of the outfit. Maybe it's somebody with a headpiece on or something, or some prosthetic. And so the placement of that key is going to reveal a lot of that detail with the appropriate amount of shadow, which will balance with the highlight and produce texture. So we'll be able to discern whether or not, we're looking at a hairy werewolf versus the creamy skin of a damsel in distress, or something in between, right? By that position of that key light, right? Whether it's high or low, from the front, from the side, or from behind, right? And then we're going to want to do things like control contrast with something we call a fill light. So once we have the shape of the face defined and the brightness, we've decided on that, right? We like a highlight or two here and there. Now what are we going to do? Now we need to control the contrast. So in other words, how much do we want to fill in this shadow? How much is this shadow important to this image? Well, in this particular image, it's very important. There's no fill light on George Clooney, because he's a thief and he's about to pull a heist, right? He's going to steal Saddam Hussein's gold from an underground vault in Iraq. What is this? This is Three Kings, right? Newton Thomas Sigel. So he's got a big shadow in here. He's conflicted. Should I do it? Should I not do it? Am I going to steal it, or am I not going to steal it? Right. So we don't use any fill light here. We don't need to see any detail over here. It's all about his eyes and the snarl, his intent. Am I going to steal it? You bet I am. It's a lot of money and I'm going to take it. Right. But a fill light will help control the contrast of the image. So a fill light is going to fill in the shadows. That's why we call it a fill light. It fills in the shadows, and we get just the right amount of shadow density in our image to suggest a softer quality to the subject, or a less intense emotion from the subject, right? More detail. The more we know about somebody, the less anxious or fearful we are of that person. We don't know a whole hell of a lot about this guy or this guy. He might be willing to do just about anything. We don't know, because there's a lot about him we don't know, and it resides in the shadow, the psyche. But she's pretty bright and open, right? And she's saying very matter of factly, I think I like you, and yeah, I might want to date you. You seem like a nice guy. There's no ambiguity here. We see the detail. We see her expression, the look on her face. She's pretty partial to Leo. I might date you. Why not? And he's like, yeah, we're good. I'm cool. I like you too. But I don't want you to know that I'm poor. You're wealthy and I'm not. I don't really want you to know that. I figure you'll find out eventually, which is why this isn't a really jet black shadow here. It's open. There's some detail there. Eventually, I'll get around to telling you that I'm poor and I don't have a lot of money. But for now, let's concentrate on the sunny side of our relationship, which is taking shape very nicely, right? In this particular slide, I ask you, where are the 3 points of the 3-point lighting scheme at work here? And it was easy to derive. This is the exposure from the sun, and the sun is very low near the horizon. We know this because it's not real bright. The image isn't real bright, and it's fairly warm in color, which would indicate a sunset position on the horizon. If you notice at sunset, the sun is always a lot redder or warmer than it is in the afternoon at high noon when the sun's high in the sky. It's very bright and it's much whiter or bluer than it is in contrast to sunset. So it's got a warm quality to it. It is reflecting off of a panel just out of frame over here or off the side of the boat, which happens to be big and white. And so we have some fill happening here naturally from reflection or return, we call it. The key light's happening here and it's coming in at this angle. And the fill light is returning by reflecting off the boat and returning on his low side. He appears half lit because of the way he's turned in his orientation towards the sun and towards the side of the boat. He's 50-50. And then of course the sky is bright behind him because the same light that's lighting him on the face is also lighting the sky. And even though it's not lighting the back of his head, the whole point of the third light in our 3-point lighting scheme is to create separation of our subject that resides in the foreground from detail occurring in the background. So if we have separation from an edge light, then our eyes can immediately find the focal point of the shot, the subject we're supposed to pay attention to, and look at them first before anywhere else in the frame by having that little edge light. So he's not exactly edge lit, but he's what we call reversed out. So he's darker in contrast to the bright sky behind him, which kind of does the same thing as what an edge light would do. It's clearly defining him in the foreground versus the background, the ocean and the horizon and the clouds in the background. So it's doing the same thing. It's creating separation. It's just not hitting him directly. Does that make sense? So you could say that he has naturally occurring 3-point lighting. And that's something that you can train your eye to look for in nature, right? Shooting around the house, for instance. Do you have a window that acts really nicely as a key light? And if you put somebody in the window light, can you find other light in the environment that might represent fill light or offer the opportunity for fill light if you redirected a little bit of it with a white card? And then can you find a background that's brighter than your subject or extremely dark in contrast to your subject that could help with the aspect of separation that you need? And if that's the case, sometimes you can find appropriate lighting in nature that resembles 3-point lighting without having to do much work at all. We call it working with available light. Okay, but you don't just accept it at random. You place your subject in that environment to maximize the effects of the window or the overhead lighting or the lamp in the background, and then use that as justification for the looks that, or the position in the environment that you place your actor, and you work with what we call available light. I ID'd some of the lighting on this frame from Schindler's List for you. This is, who is this? This is Liam Neeson. And his character's talking to this character here. Who is that? It's not Kruger. I forget who this woman is. They're having dinner in a restaurant, I think it is. And so there's some overhead lighting that's high and coming from behind Liam. So it's kind of acting like an edge light on Liam Neeson, but it's giving her shape and texture. So for her, this isn't a backlight, it's a key light, right? Her key light is Liam's edge light. And then he's kind of the same light that's edging him and keying her is bouncing off a white tablecloth, and it's redirecting some light into Liam's face. So his key light, the shape on his face, is occurring as a result of the bounce light returning onto his face. And so his key light is the bounce off the tablecloth. And then the fill light is kind of supplementary, but it's probably coming either off of her, reflecting off of her face, believe it or not, or reflecting off of this wall to her left and filling in what remains of the shadow on Liam's face. Her fill source is the white tablecloth. It's his key source, but it's her fill source because this light is much stronger in generating more texture and shape than the reflected light off the tablecloth. The opposite is true here. The only reason we see his eye sockets and his nose and his mouth is from the light bouncing off the tablecloth. So in his case, his key light is the fill source of the tablecloth, which is her fill source. His edge light is her key light, right? And then she doesn't have anything else. She's got these two values here. He's got sort of three. There's something else happening on his forehead, which couldn't possibly be the tablecloth from below because of the slope of his forehead. So it's got to be reflection from somewhere else. Could be reflecting right off of her. That happens a lot, especially when you're at very low light levels and your ISOs are very high. The camera will actually read light reflecting off of one face or a shirt. You can have a subject wearing a whiter shirt or a brighter colored shirt, reflecting light back onto the subject you're shooting in close up. And you have to decide, do I need to eliminate that by draping this person maybe with some black duvetine so it doesn't reflect, or having them stand further away from my subject in close up so they don't reflect as much into their eyes, but they keep the eye line consistent so they can talk to each other, even though they were a foot apart, now they're 3 feet apart, so that the reflections don't cause a problem, but they're still looking at each other. One's off camera, one's on camera, right? We do that a lot with the coverage and close up. We talk about that more in light and cinematography too. Also talking about edge lighting as a key light. Here's a Sigourney Weaver 3/4 back key light with no fill, very dark. Certain emotions are elicited by this kind of light. This is at the end of the movie. She's just escaped. She's thinking about going into, hypersleep with her cat, and all of her crew members are dead, right? Very emotional kind of a shot. It's either dark shadows, fear, anxiety, and is the alien really dead? And just a little sliver of a key light over here that shows us what's left of her emotional capacity at this point. Very interesting, lighting scheme. Keanu Reeves has got what we call a split key. One of his key lights is also his edge light over here. And depending on which way he turns his head, he gets a key light from the left or the right and an edge from the left, or vice versa. If he turns this way, he gets a key from the left and an edge from the right. Okay. And that happens when you put two lights directly opposite one another in a lighting scheme, right? I gave you this link to this website to play with. So this is the virtual lighting studio, and a lot of great results, lots of great solutions. The alternate solutions, I loved looking at them because it really revealed a lot of creativity and a lot of vision by a great many of you. So I was very happy to see the responses in your homework assignment from this particular app. I encourage you to keep using it. It's a great tool. It's a great learning tool. It's a little inconsistent and sometimes a little bit inaccurate in the way the lights are represented on the lighting scheme that it can generate for you, the little light plot. But if you just, strictly speaking, if you just treat it, visually, by placing lights in space and seeing the kinds of shadows that are resulting from those positions, it's very helpful, I think, and it will help broaden your lighting vocabulary very quickly. The last area of coverage for the semester was elements of composition, so framing and composition specifically. This is going to lead into a discussion I'm going to lead off with in cinematography too, about how to assemble shots for a scene, give the editor the right images to choose from to create, the drama and the flow of the narrative by which clips you shoot, which clips you don't shoot. But it all starts with each frame, and the composition, the arrangement of the elements, and the position of the frame. And we talked about pattern and repetition, balance and symmetry, texture, leading lines, and then depth of field as a compositional tool. And I showed you some examples. So there's The Empire Strikes Back with radiating lines and a central focal point. We talked about The Shining, and we talked about visual balance. So you can see left to right, you can divide this frame up and it's a mirror image on both sides. And there's also a central point on the horizon where leading lines are emanating from the foreground to the background and sort of leading us directly to an important detail back here. And you can sort of follow the lines on the tops of all the door frames the molding along the carpeting. Everything's leading us to the two little girls. We talked about lighting in terms of texture. And texture with lighting is always generated when the lights come from the side and they scrape across the surfaces of things we photograph. Any light coming from the front generates virtually no shadows that help define shape. So the light has to move around to the side. And as it does, all of the shadows that are created by the relief, we call it, the irregular surface of your subject, generates all these shadows that reveal the texture of that surface, whether it's folds of cloth in the Phantom Thread, in the brilliant dresses that Daniel Day-Lewis's character creates for his muse, or whether it's other aspects of composition. Lighting can generate texture. Okay, very important to remember. It's an important tool at your disposal. Here's leading lines again, and this was from Batman, not Begins, but something about Batman and the Joker, The Dark Knight. Yeah. And how the leading lines are heading towards the horizon. The horizon is low, not high. That's a negative connotation. And this is the bad guy. So a low horizon focal point with a bad guy makes a lot of sense, right? We're not looking at the hero. And he's low in the frame. He's less than, the center of the frame is here, and he is beneath the center of the frame. So he's lower in stature, negative connotation again. And he represents a barrier to passage into the future, which resides here on the horizon. So it's all of these psychological things dialed into the composition of the image, and then the lighting to boot. He's half lit. He's the Joker. We don't know if he's lying or telling the truth. And we can use our depth of field. And we talked about depth of field as a really great tool for creating a focal point within an image. What do we want the audience to look at? What do we want the audience to ignore, right? So here we want the audience to think about a delicious Hershey's Kiss. And we've got the subject replicated in the background, to further enhance the desire to run right out and buy a bag of chocolate and wolf it all down while you watch TV on the sofa, right? Go buy these. It's the holiday time. What better goes with holiday than Hershey's chocolate, right? It's advertising, man. It's the subtext and the culture of persuasion that is the antithesis of the advertising industry, right? And photographic composition, lighting composition, nonverbal communication has been the stock and trade of advertising from the very beginning, right? The idea of taking a subject and improving it and dramatizing it and increasing it in metaphorical stature or in dramatic stature to the point where the audience must have it, must possess it, must know it, must see it, at all costs, right? And so this is kind of what we're doing in a way. We are generating emotion. We are suggesting things to the audience like tone, attitude or mood. And that's in support of the story we're telling them in the first place, right? If we're telling them a rom-com, a romantic comedy, we don't want them to be depressed. So we don't want to use lighting that's going to suggest depressive tones. We want to use lighting that's bright and airy and golden and warm and loving and rappy and low contrast, right? If we want to scare the hell out of them, are we going to give them bright fill and warm edge lights and beautiful, comfortable tones of amber and incandescent? Hell no. We're going to give them cold blue sources that come from the back with crispy edges and very little fill light that hides details and hides ugliness and hides scars and creates fear and anxiety, right? Horror, right? And so the way we approach our lighting has very much that it can do to help a script, especially a script that is languishing with dialogue or, is not very seized with a lot of action. It's more of a thinking man's horror story. Then the lighting can really help with something like that by suggesting all kinds of unspoken emotional tones that the audience is thinking about underneath what they're seeing on the screen take place in terms of dialogue. So what is composition? It's the arrangement of objects in the frame. How do we arrange them? Do we give one object hierarchy over another? Is it proximity, the relationship of two objects within the frame? Is it balance? Is it symmetry? Is it asymmetry? Is it colorful? Is it devoid of color? All of this plays into composition, right? And one of the key principles of composition that I highlight for you is the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is dissecting your frame up to basically 9 equal quadrants. And at the intersection of the horizontal and vertical transitional lines, we get 4 specific points of interest that when we place detail on those points of interest within the frame that we want the audience to see and process, either consciously or subconsciously, we create successful images, iconic images that are immediately identifiable by our audience, right? And the audience immediately knows what to look at because we put important information at psychologically key points within the frame. And the rule of thirds identifies 4 of them by the intersection of vertical and horizontal compositional lines. Each one of these dissects the frame 1/3 vertically and 1/3 horizontally. And then these are the intersections. And at these intersections are supposed to be very, very important points within the frame. This is a symmetrical composition. We've got Keir Dullea. He's playing Dave Bowman in 2001 A Space Odyssey, and he's positioned over here. He's talking to Frank Poole over here about Hal, who's positioned right in the middle. Hal's not invited to the conversation. He's slightly out of focus. It's all about Dave and Frank suspecting Hal of malfunction and what they're going to do about it. And they don't really want Hal to be a part of that conversation because it might involve shutting Hal down. So Hal is on the outside looking in. He's slightly out of focus. He's not invited to the conversation. They're in the foreground. They're nicely edge lit. We can see them. They're lit from below, which indicates that maybe the console is on and the control panel is lighting them up, right? And outside is a brighter exterior where the what do we call this? The pod bay, right, is with all the equipment and spacesuits and everything, and Hal's sitting there wondering what they're talking about. Or here we got the hero from what was this? This was Mad Max, right? Fury Road, and he's a prisoner. He's got a iron mask on over his face, so he can't eat or drink without permission. But he gets away from his captors. He steals a gun, and when we see him in close up, he pulls the gun, levels it at his captor, and he's going to blow his head off, right? And look at that. He's at the top right 1/3. The gun's at the top left 1/3. All this is important. It's in the top of the frame, and nothing important is in the bottom of the frame, right? We also talked about the golden, what was this? The Fibonacci sequence. It's the golden ratio. We looked at it as a mathematical derivation that can be plotted on a graph. And that plot can also be superimposed over an image. And we see how this graphic representation, this mathematical representation, can lead us from maybe the previous frame into the next frame through pertinent image value or detail within the frame around to a central theme or central point or focal point, whatever the case may be. And we can follow that right around and right out, right? We talked about the quadrant theory as well, used by Newton Thomas Sigel. This is drive, right? And how we put important things in. So the hierarchy of quadrant in the West would be top to bottom, left to right. Okay, might be something different if you're talking about maybe the Middle East, where they start, for instance, in the bottom of the page. The Chinese, the Persians, they start at the bottom of the page and they work to the top of the page, and they might start on the right side and work left. Westerners start at the top of the page, start at the left and go left to right, top to bottom, right? So in the quadrant theory, the most important elements are in the upper left quadrant, and the least important details are in the lower right quadrant, right? That's a cultural bias. So you might have different compositional choices by somebody working in India, maybe, who might prefer important things to be here, right? Compositional choices and aesthetic choices, fortunately, are up to the author. So even things as simple as emotions elicited by color, you don't necessarily have to accept the traditional explanations or definitions of those choices. You can reassign anything you want as long as you give the audience enough clues that they can decipher your meaning. Okay. I gave you 3 basic shots to think about, because we'll expand on this in cinematography too. The 3 basic shots are the close-up, the medium, and the wide establishing shot. The wide shot has a very specific job. Where are we? Who's involved? What's the basic action that's taking place? The medium shot becomes a little bit more specific. Specifically, who are we talking about? This guy and this little girl. And basically, what are they talking about? Medium shot. The fine points, the key points, the most salient moment, the most important thing uttered by the subject is in a close-up. This is where we want the camera to hear the vital information revealed through dialogue. This is still somewhat performance. It's a balance of performance and dialogue. This is mostly performance and geographic location. This is all dialogue, right? The most important information is always revealed in the close-up. So there's no ambiguity. So the audience doesn't know, they don't have to choose the point in the frame they're supposed to be looking at. Am I paying attention to him? I don't know. This person has all I need to know in this particular moment, and it's revealed in the close-up. Okay. Talked about some other shots. We talked about low angle shots versus high angle shots. Low angles looking up at somebody tells us that that person is in a position of power, or realizing their potential, or learning something new, or coming to a conclusion or realization. A high angle looking down puts our subject in a place of inferiority to the camera. So they are lesser, they are weaker, they are less knowing, less important, less valuable, less, more, right? Tilted angles that go off of a perfect horizon, called a Dutch angle, indicates something out of the ordinary, something not normal. Not normal is the opposite of normal. Sick is the opposite of healthy. Corrupt is the opposite of good. So a Dutch angle is suggesting to the audience that something is not right. But we don't necessarily know what it is until we learn from dialogue or performance what that something is, right? And then I asked you guys to look at examples from Mr. Robot and interpret those examples. And so we came up with things like texture. We came up with, this is texture. This is also the interplay of highlight versus silhouette and what silhouette specifically represents. We talked about symmetry, the concept of a man in a mirror, one personality looking at another aspect of the same personality, or a different personality within the same psychological body, right? Each the intellectual or psychological half of the other. We talked about the fact that things that are ordinarily straight in nature and are bent might indicate the same thing that a Dutch angle would indicate. Something is off, something's not right. Is she hungover or inebriated. Maybe lines are bent that would normally be straight. Something's not right. Something is out of normal. And she's looking at life through smoky glasses, right? This is also an emotional or psychological suggestion that her point of view is compromised right now. She's not seeing things clearly. This is balance of color in a concept, RGB, right? Red, blue, green. Green and blue on one side, warmer tones, the reds or oranges on the other side, right? Foreground, background. And then the suggestion that these colors actually mean something: blue for technology, green for money. This is Wall Street projections on the screen over here. This is technology, computer hackers over here. This is the man in the middle, caught between the world that he's created and the conscience that he's trying to rectify or to reconcile with, right? Look at all that I have wrought, and did I really mean to do it like this? And then we talked about how selective focus can direct the audience's eye and suggest things like sharpness being reality, out of focus being unreal, two halves of the same psyche, one in reality, one in the imagination, one receding in the background, one advancing in the foreground, one in control, one out of control, right? Just by controlling depth of field. And yet we can add so many layers of information, of subtext to the value of this image by just playing with some depth of field a little bit. While we're standing here and shooting it, we could inject a little extra information or mood into the image and give the audience that's a little bit more advanced, looking for subtext and looking for undertone, give them something to chew on, you know? And that brought us to the end of the semester. So you've got 60 questions coming your way in a couple of days, and an hour and a half to do it. It's multiple choice. You got a 25% chance of being right, walking in cold, stone cold sober, right? So, but I do encourage you to study, but don't overdo it. It's not a complex exam. Pretty much everything that I'm asking you in the exam, I've covered in the presentation. So if you watch this a time or two more, and make sure that you've done the reading, you should be more than aptly prepared for the final. And that's really it. So does anybody have any thoughts or questions about any of this? Do I need to revisit anything to clarify, or are we good? Do we just want to get it over with? What's up?
Are we doing another review next week?
I'll make myself available, but I at this point I don't, if you've come to this one or if you watch this one, you don't have to partake in next week. I'll open up the Zoom and I'll take all comers, all questions.
You're gonna be there for like a Q&A almost?
Yeah, I think so. So like if you study this week and then you still have some outstanding questions that you need resolved, come back next week and ask the question and we'll deal with it. I think that's the best way to handle it.
Okay.
And if you feel good, if you're solid, then just go, open the test up on Wednesday and whack it out and then enjoy your summer,
Okay.
It's up to you. You play it, you choose.
Yeah. When do you plan on posting the PDF of the PowerPoint?
As soon as when I finish with you guys, I always compress the file and then I get it ready. I prep the video for upload to YouTube. And in the process, I can make the PDF and I can have it all pretty much up at the same time.
Okay, cool.
A couple of hours, 2-3 hours from now, it'll be up.
All right.
Okay.
Awesome.
What do you say? Anything? Any outstanding questions now? Or are you just like shell shocked and you want to go have a beer or what?
It's kind of a lot of review. Just got to take it all in. I'm feel like on my own time, and then I'm sure I'll have questions in the future.
That's the best way, you know. I mean, if you stuck with me this long, 2.5 hours, right? And you know, the best thing now I think is maybe let it marinate for, you know, look at some stuff again tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know, go look at the midterm presentation to get the stuff from the beginning of the semester. By now, hopefully it should be starting to gel for you. I try to repeat themes over the semester so that you're not hearing anything for the first time. It's usually been tied to something else. And so, you know, the study usually hopefully works out to where you start getting these really nice little aha moments where you go, oh yeah, right. Yeah, of course. This, that, you know, and then it's just really a situation where you just have to refresh your memory. And then just go in and whack it out, you know. Like I said, I'm not trying to trip you up here. My objective is not to weed anybody out and create failure where, you know, and you know, create an elite group of people who pass so that, you know, I want this to help you moving forward, you know, because I know a lot of you probably don't want to be cinematographers. You probably don't even want to work with lighting when you get out of here, but you're going to need to know it if you're an AD. You're going to need to know it if you're a director. You know, if you become an art director, you're going to work with the cinematographer a lot. You know, some art directors are just as smart as the cinematographers they work with. They just have different tools to work with, you know. You're going to be a script supervisor. You're going to want to know the details of cinematography. So you can tell the editor, hey, they used a certain lens over here, or they, you know, a certain lighting scheme over here for a post-production supervisor who's got to do CG. They want to know where the key lights are coming from all the time because that's where they base their modeling plans on, and their what do you call them? You know, their frames and their skins and everything that they add the attributes to the CG characters. They got to know where the light was on the realies so they can put it on the CG character the same way. It all comes around depending on one another at the same time on a big film. So, you know, embrace it. You know, it's not that big of a deal. I'll run you through the paces in cinematography too. If you got an appetite for it and you want more, come to cinematography too, and you'll get more of it. Otherwise, hopefully this has been an introductory conversation for you that you'll be able to use moving forward, no matter what discipline you gravitate towards. And then just know what we're about. Those of us who geek out about camera and lighting, you know what we're worried about, what we're concerned about, so that you can be effective collaborators with us in the future when you get out on the movie sets. Okay. All right. Well, then, in the absence of questions, I will assume awareness and satisfaction with the concepts covered. Do I have them? What's that?
We can adjourn.
Do I have a motion? So I have a motion to adjourn. I need a second.
I'll second that.
We have a second on the motion to adjourn. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate it. Enjoy your week. Email me if you got questions. I'll see you in the next round if you need it. And then after that, enjoy the test and enjoy the summer. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.